Hi, I'm Pastor Dave. You know that. Hi, I'm here to talk to you about the Bible and maybe this one in particular. But hi, Pastor Dave here, and I am here to bring you up to speed on matters about the Bible. This Bible in particular, because it's the one that you've been given for your own use and study. You'll notice, first of all, that there are some parts of it that are in regular type and some of them that are in shaded type. And this is the shaded parts are enrichment areas. They're not actually part of the Bible. They're comments that people have come up with to talk about the meaning of the particular section that you're reading. So first of all, one of the things that Ms. Hallie did a few weeks ago with the little children was to take a look at this Bible and to say, it's divided into two parts, and you'll notice that one part is much thicker than the other part. And actually this other part, most of that red stuff isn't even part of it. That's all maps and guides and notes and things that you may want to know about. So the bigger part, we usually call the Old Testament. You'll hear me calling it the Hebrew Scriptures a lot of the time. The smaller part is the New Testament. It is a portion that was written entirely in Greek. And I say original, but that's problematic for that second part because we don't actually, well, we don't have any original documents, any original manuscripts from either the Old or the New Testament. Now, one thing to remember about the Old Testament and the New Testament, old only indicates age. So old does not mean antiquated or useless or decrepit or broken or anything like that. It only means that it happened before the other one. Interestingly enough, to call this the New Testament is a little problematic because there is nothing in this section that isn't already found in this section. What this section does is to offer commentary and opinion and teaching about this section. Even the parts that are about Jesus, you'll notice that Jesus always is talking about the rules, the law, the prophecies, the writings that are in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now then, that thing about the law, the prophecies, and the writings. There's another Bible that I have here, and it is Tanakh. And Tanakh is actually, what they've done is to offer some vowels to go in between the consonants of that are the beginning consonants of sections of the Hebrew Scriptures. So T stands for Torah, N stands for Nevi'im or prophets, K stands for Ketuvim or writings. So Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim is abbreviated T, K, N, and you put vowel in between each and it becomes Tanakh. So this is the Hebrew Scriptures in the order in which Jewish people use it. This Bible is the Bible, well, they wouldn't have used a bound Bible, they would have only used scrolls, but in Jesus's time, this was the Bible. And anybody who you are reading in the New Testament is commenting on this Bible. So we call it the Old Testament. They divide it into three parts, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, which is, say, Jewish people divided into three parts, Christian people divided into usually 5 parts, and those 5 parts are the law, or sometimes we call it the Pentateuch, or the 5 scrolls, because there's 5 books in it: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The second section is the history. And for us, that goes from Joshua through Esther. So Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So in addition to those books, then you come to the writings, which sort of make up the middle of our Bible, or of our Old Testament, and that's Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, or Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. These are writings. We call them writings because they're not rules like the law. They usually praise the law, and they're not predictions of things that are coming. They are expressions of joy, of love for God. In this section, you will find Job, which is a really long poem that talks about how terrible things are in the world. Basically, it's one long complaint or lament to God, and it ends with God's response. You may or may not like God's response. Psalms, really, it's 150 poems or songs that are divided into 5 sections. You may notice as you go along that when it comes to this book, Jewish people really like the number 5. Then you come to Proverbs, which is a collection of advice. Ecclesiastes, which is meditation on wisdom and on the foolishness and meaninglessness sometimes of life. You'd not expect to find that in a Bible, but it's there. And then Song of Songs is a love poem that has some very sometimes humorous imagery in it. And I cannot recommend it highly enough if you want a good if you want a good laugh or giggles. Actually, they're usually giggles because of a man fondly comparing his beloved's neck to a tower, a woman talking about how much she loves her husband's shiny head. It's hysterical. It's a beautiful thing. And then after the writings for us comes a section which we call the major prophets. And the major prophets are Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, it's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. See, I have these memorized, and for some reason they just go out of my brain. And I won't go into those. The last 12 books of our Old Testament we call the minor prophets. In Jewish groups, you call it the 12, and they are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. You may be able to tell that when I was your age, I got a Bible by being able to memorize all 66 books of the Bible in order. So 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament, and I know them all. The New Testament is divided into sections also. There are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then Luke also wrote another book called Acts of the Apostles, and that is appended to the end. So there's the Gospels, Acts of the Apostles, which is sort of a history book. And then after that come letters. And there are 13 letters that are attributed to the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul being the person who really invented Christianity. Of those 13 books, it's very important to note that only 6 of them we think were certainly written by Paul. The remaining 7, it looks as though somebody wrote these purporting to be Paul in order to be able to exercise some authority, but they were close enough to Paul that they were really capturing a lot of what he sensed was important. Then you get into a portion called letters by other apostles, and those are Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. And this group, the letter from James is really probably a collection of sayings that Jesus's brother came up with. Jesus's brother, of all people, was the first person to be in charge of the church in Jerusalem. And he and Paul got into arguments. Oh my goodness, it was crazy. We actually have in Acts of the Apostles and the letter to the Galatians, the different ways in which people looked at the argument between James and Paul. Paul's side really won out as time goes on, and the things that are collected in James are portions of James's sermons that don't contradict Paul. And then Revelation is the last of the books of the New Testament, and that is a book which depicts somebody's dream. So what I would like you to do is to go to the table of contents in your Bible and to pick a book either from the Old Testament or from the New Testament. You can pick a book that's as short as you like, but I'll warn you, some of the short ones are pretty confusing. And what I'd like you to do is to select whichever book it is and just to skim it. Usually there will be headings that you can find that describe the portions that you're reading. So here we are in Nehemiah, and it says, remembering the Lord's mighty deeds. And you can look through and you can say, oh, look, it's one really, really long poem that talks about how wonderful God is and what all God has done for the people. But Nehemiah isn't just about that kind of praise. There's more of a plot to it. And what I'd like you to be able to do is just to capture a sense of the plot. If you have to read it word for word, it's not going to be that terrible. It may be a little bit confusing, but it won't take you long. Just take you a couple hours, I promise, just to get through it. It's not like you're reading a novel. This is pretty easy stuff. But what I'd like you to do, I will have sent to you a page that you can write down your impressions about that book. So that is a preliminary introduction to the Bible. It is a homework assignment. There's one other thing that I think that you need to know, actually two more things that you need to know that you can't get just from looking at the Bible or from trying to read it. And that is this. You may wonder who wrote the Bible. We like to say we don't take the Bible literally, we take it seriously. So I'm going to give to you a little bit of the serious part. It's not hard, but it's important to know. So if you want to take a break just at this time and, pause the video, I won't think any less of you. It's probably going to be helpful. Get up, walk around, have a snack, come on back, maybe sit down with the snack. And we'll talk. So go ahead and take a break. Okay, welcome back from the break. So in the early 1800s, scholars began looking at the Bible and thinking about it in some different ways than they had thought before. The contents of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, date back at least 3,000 years. And there's important things to know. First of all, you may or may not know that in the first two chapters of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, there are two stories of creation. And the first story of creation is in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4, about halfway through verse 4. And this describes the earth being created in a period of 6 days, and God resting on the seventh. The second story of creation begins somewhere around the second half of the fourth verse of the second chapter of Genesis. And it goes on from there for a couple of chapters. The earth is created just in a certain time period. They just call it a day. And story of Adam and Eve and the serpent and Cain and Abel. So in the first chapter, if you take a look, you will see that God is referred to as simply God. So right there, when God began creating the heavens and the earth. In Hebrew, the word is Elohim, Elohim. Elohim means God. It's actually a plural, but it's sort of like, sometimes we refer to royalty as speaking in the royal plural, and they say we rather than I. That's what's happening here. God is being referred to in the plural, Elohim. And it's only Elohim all the way through. When you get to chapter 2, verse 4b, there was a biblical scholar named Bultmann who realized that it's Elohim through the first chapter, and now suddenly God is being called by a name, Yahweh, or actually YHWH in English. We choose to pronounce the word Yahweh. Germans, and Bultmann was a German, would pronounce it Yehovah, but begin with the letter J. So it's Jehova. What Bultmann did was to say the phrasing here is different. The name of God is different. I think this was written by a different author than the first chapter. Thus, we established that there are two different authors. The Elohist, the person who wrote with the word God as Elohim, and J, the person who wrote with the word God as Jehovah or Yahweh. And if you notice in your Bible, on the day the Lord God, you see how Lord is capital L and then small caps O-R-D. That is an indication that the name of God has been used in the text, in the Hebrew text. And rather than break the second commandment, which is you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, they just put in the word, or they say the word Adonai whenever they see YHWH. And Adonai means Lord. And so when we write it in English, it's L-O-R-D. E, J, two different authors. When you get to the book Leviticus, actually, when you get to Exodus around chapter 20, you suddenly realize that there is someone who is writing now who is very bent on you understanding what all the rules are. And there are 613 laws that are listed in the first 5 books of the Bible, really the second 3 books of the Bible, Leviticus, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And there, the law is where the law really comes forward. We call the writer of this portion the priest. And so these are the priestly sections. And the reason we call them the priestly sections is because there are a lot of rules that have to do with how you make sacrifices and how to build the temple and all that sort of thing. So you've got the Elohist, E, you've got the Yahwist, J, now you have the priestly, P. There's one last one. You'll notice that I have not mentioned the 5th book of the Bible in any of these discussions. Well, that book was probably written at a time when a king was making, a king of Israel was making a lot of changes. and wanted those changes to be as official as possible. And most of those changes had to do with how to practice your religion. And so you have the fifth book of the Bible, Deuteronomy, which stands alone in as much as you don't have ED or P in it, you just have D. So J, E, J, D, P. And when you read the Bible, sometimes in those first 5 books, sometimes you won't even notice that, as people didn't for many, many years, and Bultmann discovered so brilliantly, you won't notice that there are different authors. As a matter of fact, the story of Noah in the 8th and 9th chapters and 10th chapters of Genesis actually are 2 different stories that have been so carefully woven together that you almost don't notice that you have no idea how many animals he brought onto the ark. Was it 2 of every kind, or was it 2 of all the animals that run wild and 7 of all the animals that you can eat or have as part of your working life? It's a pickle. It's a pickle. But there's, that contradiction actually lies right there, and you don't even notice it because there was a 5th person who was contributing to the writing of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that 5th person is called the redactor, the person who went in and took out some stuff and left some stuff in and then wove it all together into a very, very clever set of stories so that you don't even notice that they go together the way that they do. The first 5 books of the Bible are sometimes called the books of Moses because Moses is featured so prominently from Exodus through Deuteronomy, but it is not because Moses wrote these books any more than Jesus wrote the Gospels or Paul wrote all of his letters. The redactor was the one who pulled all of this together. These stories were told and told and told for many generations, and it was during the 40 years of what we call the exile. The exile was a period of time where the really wealthy people in the merchant class of Israel were taken away from their home. The Babylonians overtook the southern kingdom of Judah in 586 BCE. So from 586 until about 540, 538 or so, the people of Israel were in exile. The richer people of Israel were in exile in Nineveh and Babylon. And during that time, they came to the conclusion that they needed to collect all of their writings together into one group. And that's when they came up with the law of the prophets and the writings. But they were 40 years in exile. And it reminded them very much of the origin story of their people. And that was the Exodus. That was the time that, according to their collective memory, Israel was held in captivity, and more than just in captivity, they were held in bondage. They were slaves in Egypt. And the great story that happens in the Torah, and the story on which all of Jewish identity really is extended, is the story of the Exodus and the escape from slavery into freedom and the return to be able to have their own land, their own place to live. Again, 5 contributors or authors of the first 5 books of the Bible. And the first 5 books of the Bible are the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those books were collected together by someone we call the redactor. And the redactor was putting together the works of the Elohist, the Yahwist, the priest, and the Deuteronomist. I know I probably just bored you out of your minds, but it gets worse. That is because the first 5 books of the New Testament were written by at least 4 different people, and it's kind of creepy, or maybe a little disconcerting to realize that those 4 people were not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those 4 books, none of them actually has a title saying who wrote them. We just, tradition has said, first one was by Matthew, second one by Mark, third one by Luke, fourth one by John, and then the 5th one by Luke. Acts is written by Luke. Here's the thing. Mark, even though it's the second in the series, was the first one that was written down. And it was written down sometime around the year 70, which was the year that the temple was destroyed. And because Jesus had predicted that the temple would be destroyed, somebody thought it would, and partly because all of the apostles were dying. I mean, they were in their 70s by that time, if not older. And, either had been killed or were getting on in age. The gospel according to Mark was written down. The Gospels according to Matthew and Luke came next within the next 10 years. Matthew writing for an audience in what's now present-day Syria, and Luke sort of writing for people who would have been in the churches that Paul had created in Turkey and in Greece. Both of them writing in Greek, as did Mark. There are portions of Mark that have been pretty much copied verbatim into Matthew and Luke. And then there's a sayings gospel called Q, and nothing of Q can be found in Mark, and we've never found a copy of Q. We just know that it had to have existed because it's a bunch of sayings of Jesus that were being repeated enough that Matthew and Luke both have them, but for some reason Mark left them out. Then there are portions of, so there's Mark, there's Q, then there are portions of Matthew that are found only in Matthew, and you may know that the story of the Magi, the story of the 3 wise men, is only found in Matthew, and that the story of the shepherds and the angels is only found in Luke. In addition to that, there are certain stories that are found only in Luke, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, and there are similar stories that are only found in Matthew, like the story of the sheep and the goats. So you've got 4 different sources of these books. Mark itself, Q, which we call Q because some German came up with it and said, it's the Quelle, it's the source. And stories known only to Matthew, stories known only to Luke. And of those first 5 books, 4 of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, were compiled from in this way. And then there's the Gospel according to John, which uses familiar stories in the first 4, specifically the Passion, but totally retells the story of Jesus' suffering and death in ways, to make it look like he wasn't a weakling, because you might read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and when you get to the part where Jesus is about to be arrested, it can look to some people as though he's a bit weaker than than you would want. In Luke, he actually weeps knowing that he's going to die. And John didn't like that. And so retells the story so that Jesus is in charge of everything from start to finish. So does that mean, as there were 5 writers of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that there are 5 writers of the first 5 books of the New Testament? No, it means that there are actually more, because Mark is standing alone. Matthew is using 3 different sources, Mark, Q, and the other sources of Matthew, and then there's a person who's actually putting them together. So that's 4 people writing Matthew. It's the same with Luke, and then probably just 1 person writing John. The other thing to note is they're being written in 70, 80, and in John's case, around 90, 95. Paul's writing in probably 30 or 40 to begin with. So that First Thessalonians, okay, so I said 30 or 40, it's around the year 40, is earlier than any of those first 5 books. And the first 3 of those books, in telling the story of the Last Supper, depend almost entirely on language that is found in 1 Corinthians in chapter 11. So 1 Corinthians is earlier than Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John refer to circumstances and events that happened much earlier than what you find in 1 Corinthians. So yeah, it's just trying to blow your mind. You may have fallen asleep by now. If so, wake up. Anyway, it's stuff to know about the book. I've talked long enough. You need to go and do other things. Probably need a nap by now if you stayed awake for the whole thing. If you have any questions about anything that I've said, please don't hesitate to call or ask, or send me a text. I will be happy to reply. Thank you for paying so much attention. I'm realizing that the advantage of electronic video is that you can pause it, you can go back, you can play it again, and try to figure out what the pastor was telling you. But thanks for joining me for this time, and blessings to you as you read your book of the Bible, and report back to me when we gather again at our next confirmation class session. Take it easy now. Bye-bye.